Well, welcome to our inaugural Design for Change EduFuturism learning series, our very first episode here, I suppose, of this, moving up the ladder, learning from video game tutorials. Now, before we really jump in on what that means or what we're going to be doing today, let's just go ahead and give a shout out to all of our awesome supporters, because as with all of our resources, this series is made possible by our supporters, and you can certainly support us at humanrestorationproject.org. So I also wanted to give a quick preview of what is yet to come in the EduFuturism learning series. So if you go to humanrestorationproject.org/learning, and there's a link on the Figma down here too, you can find the other sessions in this series going on here in the next couple of months. So we really have 4 tracks planned. This is the first of the Design for Change learning from video games track. We'll also have a using AI without losing ourselves, the ethics and application of AI, breaking bubbles, navigating social media and online extremism, using and problematizing social media, and fighting back against the future, solar punk, social justice, and speculative fiction. So our next session in Designing for Change will actually be understanding player behavior, making design choices with Seth Koster, one of the co-founders and the CEO of Butterscotch Shenanigans, which is an indie game studio out of St. Louis, Missouri. They've made Crashlands and Levelhead and Quadrupus Rampage and all other kinds of games too. So that'll be at February 11th at about this same time. So you can go ahead and register for that now, and you'll get the reminders as we all go through this.
So before we jump into like what exactly we're doing as an activity, I think it's worthwhile to define like why we're doing this and why like Human Restoration Project has become so interested in this as a topic, as well as the other edu-futurism stuff, which is if you're not familiar, semiotic domains and the concepts of semiotics, especially when it pertains to video game design, was very much studied by James Paul G back in like the early 2000s, and how video game design is very similar to the concepts of human learning. And we put together a resource collection that talks about this. And this is a screenshot on the left from those resources. And the general idea is essentially semiotic domains are the terms, the definitions, the concepts that you know when you understand a topic. So for example, in K-12 education, we're very much familiar with ideas like PBL or Bloom's taxonomy, or these different terms that are just like, I know what that thing is, for better or for worse. As we explore then other concepts that also deal with learning, there's other terms and definitions. So for example, e-learning, a lot of folks are familiar with the ADDIE model, which might not mean anything if you're a K-12 educator, but means a lot if you're an e-learning. Similarly, video game and board game designers, which is this little connection here, also have all of their own key terms like mechanics and elegant design and tutorials, which we're diving into right now. What James Paul G found was that the more you understand a related semiotic domain, the terms and definitions and concepts of something that's other than your own, the better you not only understand the new semiotic domain, you also understand your own semiotic domain better. Or in other words, you get a new perspective on the thing that you already know by looking at it through a different lens. So our goal is, as we go through this, even though we're talking about game design, the goal is that for teachers as experts, as we go through it, to have those aha moments where like, oh, that's the same thing that we were talking about when it came to teaching the other day. It's all very much related. And that's why we're doing all of these different content, is to think about it in that way. So Nick, if you want to take it away to the first thing.
Yeah, now that we know why we're all here, right? I was just eager to jump into the doing part of things. All right. So the reason why we're here today, I'll zoom out here a little bit, is to actually talk about how we can train players to play the game, or what makes a good tutorial versus a poor tutorial. And we thought, since we're going to be discussing a lot of examples of good ways of training players and thinking about skill range, elastic challenges, and failure traps, and some of those other related concepts, we would just actually start with some examples of bad tutorials, bad user UI, some of the other things that make for a not so great gaming as a learning experience. And you can see on the text up here, it says, in order for a game to be enjoyed, it must be understood. So why do so many players not come back to games? Why are tutorials often boring or frustrating? And these are 4 examples of bad video game design, particularly of teaching players to play the game. And we would thought we would just open the floor up here if you want to use those Figma skills to be able to drag and drop some sticky notes on here and just say, for each one of these, what makes this bad tutorial design, bad UI design, bad video game design for learning. And Chris and I will add our thoughts on here too in just a moment.
And what are we looking at there, Nick? What are those screenshots of?
I think on the left-hand side up here, we have something that's from a mobile game. I don't really know the origin of
Well,
this one.
I'm saying
Tapping
like,
on a
so
pig to
it's like you
select it.
open up the game
Yes.
and like
Yeah,
text pops up and it
you
tells
got
you
it.
exactly what to do. You click through it and then you start playing the game. To consider for each one of these games or these concepts, what makes them bad game design? You just have like a text pop up that tells you what to do. Because that just seems like the most simple solution. Just tell people exactly what to do and then they'll do it.
Let's see here. I think we can probably, if people are still adding some thoughts to there, perhaps we can just discuss them, and as people have more ideas, we can tag those as we go. So yeah, let's just start over here with the with this. I don't know. This is like a mobile game UI design or something, instructing us to tap on the pig to select it, touch anywhere on the screen to move the pig in this direction. Although it doesn't seem like we actually have access to whatever it is it's trying to get us to do. So Christopher Barber says front loads too much information to be processed by the player. Note the dots at the bottom. So what Christopher rightly points out is this is like the first step in the process, and whether or not we actually get to touching the pig, or what the next step is in this tutorial, we may or may not actually be able to play the game before we can access that next part. Let's see here. Let's go to the other ones, then we can kind of tag on there. Now, my eyes just glazed over at this second one. I don't know if that was the same case for you all, but yeah, I just said there's too much going on. I'm going to forget what all of this does. So yes, good job. You've successfully built your first room on the cruise ship. But if this is the kind of feedback that I'm going to get for every single motion that I go through in the tutorial, there's just going to be way too much for me to be able to process that kind of as I go through the rest of the game. So yeah, way too much going on, both in the user interface and in the tutorial mode here as far as learning design goes. Yeah, and Ryan added over here on the side. Now, whether that this is an overarching comment that could go for all 4 of these examples, or if it's for one of these in particular, show then tell, not tell then show. Yeah, particularly with this this bottom example here, which I don't know if this is supposed to be third person or first person, but yeah, there's just a lot going on here as well. So hold E to use the Bacta dispenser, stand in front of the device, hold down the use button until your health has been fully restored. There's probably a way to indicate to the player in the moment here what impact this is having using the UI cues in the user interface, rather than just walking them through, the list of instructions. Show rather than tell. Let the player experience that, and you'll need to tell them just a lot less. Hopefully we can click continue without hints to go through the rest of this here as well. And then we also got, there we go. We got Chris's comment over here in blue. Players may not even understand why these things do what they do. They just hit the buttons they're told to. And that was my beef with this mock-up, perhaps, of if Mario was redesigned as a mobile game or as a game today, rather than just jumping into the world and figuring out, given the physical controller that you have in your hand, what buttons do what, sort of in the context of playing the game. This hand holding doesn't actually train the player to play the game. It just treats the tutorial as a list of steps to be completed before you actually get into playing the game. So you don't have a context for understanding why it is that you're doing the things that you're doing. And who knows whether or not those skills will actually transfer. It seems like you have to relearn the game before you actually get into playing the game. What do you want to add to that, Chris, before we start talking about good examples of tutorials in game design?
The only thing I'd add is that as we go through this, consider, because we'll get to it here in a little bit, what does that look like in a classroom context if it's the first time that you're doing something? So you just booted up the classroom, if you will. What would it look like in terms of instruction to front load the information in this way and then have students rather than players go through those motions. So that is kind of the whole point. But we'll sidetrack here for a second and talk about difficulty and then piece all of this together at the end. So we'll have a little bit of like a more relaxed part here as we go through some presentation stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, if the tutorial is going to be the player's first experience with playing the game, this clearly this format circumnavigates that and says before you can actually get to the game, you have to complete some arbitrary amount of steps that's not necessarily related to playing the game, but is supposed to teach you up front how to do it. So yeah, let's talk about how we can actually provide various levels of experience and different entry points and how to scaffold and avoid the failure traps of planning for game design. And then, by proxy here with our semiotic domains, then learning design as well. So yeah, when we talk about skill range, if you follow this diagram over here, just thinking about games like classrooms have increasing difficulty, the more we have to think about. So on the left-hand side over here, we have a skill floor. So this is basically the skill level, be they the attitudes, the aptitudes, the interests, all those things wrapped into this. This is the minimum. You must be this tall to ride the ride kind of idea to get on board. So whether that's, accessibility, whether that's referring to interest or skill level, that's sort of the skill floor that we'll talk about there. That's the least challenging aspect of it. And then on the other extreme, we have at the extremely challenging side, we have the skill ceiling, where a player can no longer improve. And of course, we want to avoid this because in a game design experience, that means that the player has maxed out their ability to play the game. So where else do they have to go from there? Now, in the classroom context, then that just means, you've hit the wall, you've learned all that you can do, you've applied the skills to, your maximum context. And I think you can click on some of these images and they should play as GIFs to kind of give a video game context for these as well. So the skill floors are the bare minimum amount of skill that the game with that game to participate in the game effectively. So that's like the status quo that developers have modeled the game around. If you're not good to meet that floor, you're going to have a hard time, right? So the goal is to raise the skill ceiling as high as possible to have an easy to learn but difficult to master context. If people hit the skill ceiling too early, they'll get bored. They've already figured everything out. So the goal of gaming and learning design is to create a low floor, high ceiling experience for players and learners at a range of skill levels for players to enter, exit at their interest and at their ability level. So if the floor is too high, you alienate less skilled players. If the ceiling is too low, you limit the ability of the player to progress and thus continue to play the game. So we're going to kind of layer on top of this then the notion of elastic challenges, because elastic challenges really refers to then the trick of providing a multiple means of engaging in the game, because then no matter at your skill level, if you're a low skill player or a high skill player, you have something to engage with. And for this example, we use the example of Minecraft. And again, you should be able to click on these and they'll play as GIFs so you have some kind of context for what's going on here. So yeah, at the lowest skill floor for a game like Minecraft, you have a player who's just learning to navigate the environment, right? You get dropped into the world of Minecraft. You don't have any tools, right? You're walking over and realizing that you can manipulate the ground. You can manipulate the trees. You can collect those items. What can you do with those? Build the most rudimentary house that's possible. And perhaps even in survival mode, then it prompts a context for you to do that because you need to be safe from the skeletons and zombies and creepers and stuff that come out and attack you at night. So the lowest skilled players are just learning to navigate the space and just kind of function in that world, right? At the second level, you've kind of mastered that initial lowest tier. You're decorating your home. You're making a more complex space, at least in this image, or you're working to level up your armor and your items and things, and you're expanding your reach and your comfort within the game. But you've kind of mastered those basic movement skills. Now, the third highest tier is the player kind of engaging at that high high-end content. You know, you've gone to the end, you're fighting the Ender Dragon. I think that's what's supposed to be in this GIF over here. You're engaging in more of the skilled activities of the game. Now, Minecraft is an open world, so you can choose to engage at that level. A lot of players might never necessarily even get to that point and choose not to do that. And then at the highest tier here in the Minecraft world is the PvP model. You know, in the open survival mode, engaging against other players, because now you're not only having to put your skills to the test, but, you know, combat them against others, or, you know, even in a more multiplayer collaborative mode, right? You're trying to build those same skills together. So yeah, elastic challenges, basically giving the player or the learner multiple points of entry, so that way, no matter their skill level, there's something in the world that you can engage with that, you know, keeps your interest, your motivation, your engagement, and keeps you progressing at a level that keeps you engaged in the game. So the training aspect of this comes into play then, where we say, okay, what should your player be doing by the end of the game? Or how do you train your player to play at all of those various skill levels? And does the early and mid-game experience really support that? And for this, we actually have a video, which I will have to play, and I'll get it pulled over here in a second.
You'll have to tab back over to the Zoom because you can't play
Yep.
Figma videos full screen. So,
Yep.
yeah.
I'll get it on my screen here. But really, in this context, one game did this very well and documented it. I don't know if y'all have ever played Super Meat Boy. Chris can probably go on at length about SMB. I don't think I ever played it. So, but there's a fascinating, there we go, clip that actually shows and walks us through training the player to play the game. So I'm going to share this. I'm going to share my sound, and hopefully y'all can see that on my screen over here. And I'll turn my sound up. Real quick clip. Here we go.
Level design. So the basic formulas of level design go: when you start out, you want to teach the player how to play. And you need to make sure that they understand every mechanic of the game. So every level in the first chapter needs to have some example forcing the player to do something in order to beat the level that they will need further in the game. So like there's a level, I think level 3, that is just a gap. And the only way to get over that gap is to hold down run and jump. You can't get it any other way. You can't just keep jumping around. You won't jump far enough. And that's to make sure that the player understands that in order to get over far gaps, that you need to press and hold the run button and jump across it. It's simple. It sounds like a no-brainer, but it's something that usually in games it would just say, hold run to jump far. Most people will just skip the text and they will forget. Now, just in case somebody didn't play that level, a couple levels later, I reiterate and I give them another section of a level that requires them to run and jump to make sure that they know how to do it, because it's important. Like, all these mechanics are very important. And each level in the chapter is another level that pushes that. Like, there's a level where you need to continuously jump up one wall because there's no other wall to jump to. That's me teaching the player that you can do this. And everybody in the world will see a problem and want to solve it. So if you see something where it's just a wall and you don't realize you can keep jumping up the wall, you're going to try it right away. And once you try it yourself, you taught yourself, not only do you feel smart, like you've figured out something yourself, you also now for sure know how to do that from then on in the game. So all these levels of introduction they go through everything, and once you've basically cleared out all the things you can do with Meat Boy, then you start introducing new mechanics.
On YouTube, a lot of tech creators have
fell victim to the autoplay there. All right. So basically, right, what you heard there in the designer of Super Meat Boy is thinking about that idea, of how can we scaffold low skill players who are brand new to the game, get them using the game by playing it, figuring it out for themselves with these kind of low skill challenges, and really scaffolding up the skills that they're going to need by the end of the game to be successful. And of course, to ramp up the challenges as they go. And so really the question as far as training the player, and of course, in the classroom context, training students, is how does that early and mid game experience support, an ever growing skill ceiling and kind of ever growing agency within the world of the game or within the world of the classroom? Because the idea is the more skilled you become as a player, the more that you should be able to do in that world. And we'll kind of think about those in the next part here when it comes to learning design for classrooms as well. And I think here I'll kick it over to Chris to talk failure traps.
Yeah, sure thing. So we got a few more concepts here, and then we're just going to tie it all together and talk about it for like really at length. So one thing to consider as we're moving up and training players through these different tutorials is what happens if the player is eventually presented with a scenario where they can no longer progress. So they get to something that's so difficult, so annoying, so frustrating, so taxing that they just give up and they go all the way back over here to this failure trap region. They've gone to the point where they can no longer progress. As a video game example, probably the best I could think of is in Resident Evil, classic horror game. You used to have to collect items called ink ribbons in the game world, and that's how you saved the game. So you would find the ink ribbons, and that's how you would save your progress so that when you came back, you were able to continue playing on from that point. Now, the problem is that if you were not so great at this game and you were saving a lot, uh, you would eventually run out of ink ribbons, which is a classic failure trap because if I can't save the game anymore, I could be 2 or 3 hours in, lose, and then have to start over 2 hours previous, which most people at that point are just going to give up. Because if it was already challenging enough to the point where I ran out of ink ribbons, chances are I'm not going to be able to progress from there. It's punishing you for doing poorly because you're doing poorly. It's the losers lose even further. And as a result, in the remake of this game in recent history, they've gotten rid of this as a mechanic unless you're playing on like a special challenging difficulty. Games try their best to overcome failure traps. So that way this doesn't happen and you continually play the game. So moving on to this next point here, a lot of games are constantly thinking about, well, how do we ensure that players never get to the point where they give up? How do we make a game as challenging as possible, if the game is meant to be challenging, without players just giving up and falling victim to failure traps? One way that games will do that is by normalizing failure and making it part of the gameplay loop, as in it's expected that you're going to fail. Probably one of the most popular games recently, Hades, does this quite well, where the game knows that you're going to lose. You get rewarded for losing. Basically, the more and more you play the game, if you continually lose over and over again, the more and more things you'll unlock. And in a sense, the game actually gets easier as you play it. If you keep losing, you'll get more and more rewards. If you keep winning, you'll get fewer and fewer rewards to the point where it's adaptive to your skill level. In order to overcome failure traps, video games typically are either going to make the content easier over time. So if you keep losing over and over again, the game's just going to get easier to make it easier for you to get through, or or they'll make the failure part really fun. If the game is fun enough that you enjoy practicing it and going through the motions over and over again, chances are you're completely okay with the fact that you have to keep doing the exact same content over and over again. The issue is when you run into a scenario where it's so frustrating that you no longer want to go through the practicing motions and you get caught in a failure trap. More on that in classrooms here in just a second. Two more concepts to consider. This one's slightly different, which is skill range. So as players are progressing up this difficulty curve from less challenging to extremely challenging, they're also going through different types of play. This Street Fighter here is an example. I used to play a lot of Street Fighter. Uh, there's 3 levels that they progress through. The manual level, which is where you start, is where you're learning what the buttons do. So you're looking at your controller and going like, oh, that button is punch, that button's kick. Here's how I do a combo in a fighting game, for example. The manual level is I'm just getting the ropes of it. It's the rote memorization or the basic concepts. I then progress into the situational, which is the majority of where I'm learning how to play a game, which is I'm presented with a variety of different scenarios and I'm learning what buttons make the most sense to hit there. And a game like Super Meat Boy, it's like, how do I get around that saw, and how do I execute getting around that saw by hitting the jump and run button? It's basically being presented with any scenario and knowing how I'm going to hit the buttons and in what order. The final level, which not all players might even get to, is the mental level, which is where you're transcending the game itself. It's the meta game. It's predicting what might happen and then adjusting as a result. You'll most likely see the mental level in player versus player games where maybe you're reading what your opponent's going to do. Maybe you're playing mind games, like you're intentionally playing bad in order to make the other player think that you're worse. You'll see mental a lot in maybe board games like chess, where players will intentionally mess with each other in order to make them make different moves as a result. You've gone beyond understanding what the buttons do at different points, and you've transcended into like psychology, which is the mental level here at the top. Ostensibly, as you move up and become better at fighting games, the more you understand these concepts, when you get into a different game, you'll then move up this ladder even faster. So if I'm at this top level here of mental and I pick up another fighting game, I'm probably going to start up at a higher skill range than someone who has never played a game before. They're going to be here at the manual level. Finally, last but not least, there's also considering a game's difficulty. Games are designed typically in one of three ways when it comes to how we're moving up this ladder and how we set how hard the game is going to be. A lot of games use explicit difficulty, which is the most simple. You pick a difficulty level and then you go through levels, or you go through the game. So there might be like an easy, medium, and hard. I choose the difficulty level that makes most sense to me, and then I go through it. And the game has defined for me how the game gets more difficult over time. You're on a track, a preset track. Some games use an adaptive difficulty, which was what that Hades example was, which is as you do poorer or as you do better, the game gets more easy or more difficult. Over time, the game is going to adjust to meet your skill level. It's going to adapt to those scenarios. Finally, some games use an implicit difficulty, which is where the player is choosing how hard or how difficult the game is going to be at any given point. Perhaps they're choosing the difficulty level to level, perhaps they're making the levels themselves, or maybe there's a bunch of different game modes where some days I might want the easy stuff and some days I might want the hard stuff. But I can kind of intermix however I see fit. Arguably, the most popular games are all implicit games. Thinking about games like Fortnite, League of Legends, Minecraft, Rocket League. Those are all games where you can play the super intense ranked mode and it's the most difficult possible content. But there's also like fun party modes, which are super easy. And some people never participate in some of the game modes because that's not what interests them. I can choose exactly what I want. And there's a lot of different things to consider here when it comes to school, which builds us into this massive diagram here at the bottom, which is the meat of this presentation. Nick, do you want to walk through what we're doing here and get us started with the first discussion?
Yeah, so this big purple space here, it's apparently like slide 9 or something, is where we are going to collaborate in order to help build those connections between the concepts up in the top part of the presentation that you all have access to classroom design. So how do those video game tutorials relate to the classroom? And I believe we're just going to kind of walk through kind of step by step, again, not to just turn you loose to it all at once, but we'll just kind of see here what your classroom's skill floor is. So if you see over here on number on letter A, got the skill floor, and you can either drag and drop a sticky note, you can copy and paste the sticky that's over on the left-hand side over here as well, but just somewhere on here, and Chris and I can obviously engage in this too. I'll zoom in for the benefit of our YouTube audience. There we go. But let's just kind of unpack, right? What is the bare minimum skill level, the skills, the aptitudes, attitudes perhaps students might need just to be like, you must be this tall to ride the ride in the classroom, in which you have taught, you're teaching in currently, or you imagine yourself teaching in the future.
Or a classroom you've attended.
Yes,
as well.
certainly.
Because sometimes the skill floor, this isn't necessarily a perfect scenario. These could be bad things too. So to share an example I would have before we kind of dive deeper, I think that a skill floor that's very common in schools would be speaking English. Like for English language learners, if they enter into a class and they struggle with speaking the language, that's a pretty big skill floor to overcome that you're starting down here in this orange area. Because if you don't understand what's being taught, how in the world are you supposed to progress up this ladder without adjustment? And people's skill floors are all going to vary. So we're kind of predicting here what might occur.
And I
So I
think
can
too,
set
now
this
that
back.
I'm
Yeah, go
talking
ahead.
about it, I think maybe there's even we can kind of chunk this out here and just think that part B over on the right hand side of the screen is the skill ceiling. So I think it makes sense then at the same time that we're thinking of skill floors in relation to
Okay.
the classroom, let's also think of ceilings, and then you can always add to your stickies as we kind of unpack those and as we talk about them here in a moment, and that way we can just chunk those two pieces together. So what do we think? Should we just set another
Yeah.
minute timer here? Right, let's start to unpack the skill floor. I think what's really interesting is this exercise in itself could really help amplify a lot of issues related to student success in the class. And when I think of students who get stuck in failure traps, which is kind of where we'll head next from here, some students never even make it through the skill floor regardless of seat time in the classroom, just because they don't, come with the implicit and explicit, skills that the classroom context demands. And yeah, I think one thing that Ryan had put in the chat is a link. Perhaps we can put in the YouTube video as well. Hard mode is my norm: gaming, accessibility, and community from the STEMpunk site there. But of course, accessibility in design for the course can lead to failure traps where students, for accessibility reasons, can never achieve higher than that skill floor just because we haven't provided the on-ramps necessary to do that. And Christopher Barber here says can vary by course, which is why guidance counselors are so important. Which level is right for me? And so there's even that question of scaffolding within the coursework itself, but then also, right, at what levels can different courses perhaps meet different student needs I mean, I hate to use this word, but differentiate, within that range of possibilities. And Chris adds to that general content knowledge. Many will assume the content is already taught and will end up reteaching. Yes. And when we think about scope and sequence, how much of skill floors are baked into what you were supposed to have learned in previous years, either in a math class or I think of perhaps like a modern language class, things where there tends to be an accumulation of those content and skills over time. And I had put in here as well, those navigating those social cultural norms, the mores of school, perhaps some technology barriers. And Chris had said speaking English as well. So yeah, a lot of those really do just speak to the accessibility. Can you access the cultural capital? Can you access the language? Do you have the technological abilities, content, some of those other parts? Yeah, tech, UDL, cool, neurodivergence, all those things. Let's take a look at the skill ceiling. I think there were some interesting comments over here because I don't know, in my thinking of skill ceilings, it's really interesting given what the ceiling is. Does it just mean getting 100% and you can just forget about the class entirely and don't have to think? Well, that seems less like a skill ceiling and another version of a failure trap. You're preventing students from sticking with it, elevating their skill level, kind of taking it to the next level on their own. And we got some other comments here. Should the course learning objectives act as the skill ceiling? If so, what has happened if students don't meet them or instead exceed them? What does it look like to exceed them or apply those mechanics in new, and do we provide opportunities for students to do those things in new and unique ways, to build something, to construct something new other than just meet the objectives of the class? I've never felt that meeting the objectives of the class should be, necessarily the skill ceiling. It should act as a skill gate, says Barber here, where students who are far ahead can move on to a more advanced course of study. Yeah, I mean, if you've met all of the requirements for a course, who's to say that it doesn't turn into an independent study where teachers can ask, well, what can you do next with what you've learned, or how can you apply it? Perhaps that's where like open-ended PBL can really be a huge boon to some of those things as students begin to develop and ask questions and do some of those too. And Ryan, hyperlexia brought me against the ceiling. And let's see here, Splinter skills of neurodivergent people. Ryan, if I could have you just unpack that a little bit more, either in the sticky notes, and we can kind of come to that. But yeah, it's really for me, it's coming back to that idea of designing elastic challenges for all of those different levels, right? How do we provide low floor, meaning prime accessibility, multiple means of accessing technologically, in person, in a number of different ways, video, text, audio, all those different means, in multiple languages, in multiple different formats, the content, the discourse, the tools that students will need to be successful, and then just really asking, well, what is our end goal with them? What should they be able to do with this by the end? How can they apply these in new and unique ways? And then really, and I'll zoom out here on my screen here, and really then, like, how do we provide? Really, the next question is, how are students challenged at multiple levels? So perhaps we could move the sticky note conversation there, which is, at any one of these points, or just somewhere up here by point C, what opportunities or what challenges, what are the gatekeepers that prevent students from moving from one point to the next? What are the sticky spots that keep students stuck in those? And I think we'll even group together C, D, and E, right? How are students engaging at these levels? And then let's brainstorm failure traps too. So let's tackle space C. This might be a lot, but I just want to be conscious of our time. How are students challenged at each of these different levels? How are students engaging at these levels? What are those potential failure traps? So, so space C up here on our skill range, space D down here at the manual, situational, and mental, and then let's brainstorm some of those failure traps. We can unpack those too. All right, I was finishing up my own sticky note. Chris, do you want to walk us through this one? People don't have to hear my voice this whole time.
Sure, I can certainly do that.
You're good. I'll follow you so I can see where you're at.
So yeah, in terms of this, and I'll do this here. Kind of going through first off, and these two questions, C and D, are heavily related to each other. So I'm going to kind of pop between the two in terms of how are students being challenged at these different difficulty levels. It seems like as we start the process, we're really looking at like key terms, vocabulary, reading, and then Chris adds, and history sources can be adapted to various levels. The docs become longer and contextualized as we move up the ladder. However, as he notes, and we'll get to that in a second when it comes to failure traps, the issue is that not all students learn at the same rate. So you could easily start going backwards as you are moving up that ladder, and you're like, oh, this is getting more and more difficult, or I'm learning in a different way, or this doesn't interest me, and I start to go back towards the left-hand side. So we start off with the easier stuff of learning the vocab, but it's not easy for everyone. It's the same thing down here if we think about the manual level. We're learning the basic concepts of a lesson, unit, or project. These are the building blocks for the rest of the content that we're going to talk about. We're understanding, as Nick says, the mechanics of the classroom. And in a video game context, that would be like running and jumping. Well, we're learning the buttons. And these are the things that we're going to utilize for the rest of the course. And we're considering, well, now how am I going to use these things, and how do I learn how to use the controller? Some folks, as we just said, might not be familiar with what a controller is. They might not know what the buttons are. So it's going to be very difficult for them to even approach this manual level. Or in a worst case scenario, the course could be designed in a way where the learning is not even easy at the manual level for various different reasons. It's not designed with everyone in mind. So some people get stuck down here at this manual point, at this low skill range. As we then move up, and I'll kind of progress back there to the middle level, this is where you start to have opportunities, hopefully, in a perfect scenario, as Nick describes, for voice and choice. So you're starting to figure out, now that I understand this basic content, how can I figure out what I'm going to engage in? What are my boss fights of the classroom? How am I going to complete activities that utilize the vocabulary, whether that be in discussions or activities? This is where, hypothetically, the majority of a classroom should occur, in the situational point here in the center. It's where you're starting to apply that content to a variety of different topics and discussions.
And Chris,
Finally,
I will add to,
yeah, Go ahead.
Can I add
Yeah,
to
yeah.
my sticky? I know I turn it
Sure.
over to you and I'm going to interrupt real quick because in the video game context, you have those authentic challenges, right? It's like you have the boss fight, which says, okay, let's put your skills to the test and see if you're ready for the next level. And you'll get a lot of immediate feedback about whether you're not, whether you need to go back and level up or whether you need to get better loot or whether you need to get even just skill up in terms of, your own manual dexterity and some of those other things. You'll get immediate feedback in that boss fight about whether you're competent, skilled enough in order to make it. Well, a lot of times in the classroom, we just don't, there's not like a skill check like that where it shows put all your things to the test here, like in these true, authentic ways. You'll get this immediate feedback and we'll decide whether or not you move on. It's like the class just moves on whether you're ready or not. So you could get a D or an F or, whatever in a traditionally graded classroom. And it's like, well, get good. We're moving on. And so I think in my context, I always try to think about it in terms of competence. It's like I want you to be competent. I want you to be able to show that you can do the skills, so that way you're not left behind when you advance, and then provide opportunities for students to either work at more of that manual level or the lower situational level to shore up those skills so you'll be more successful in the long run, and provide students for whom maybe that manual or situational level, they come in at a higher skill level and then say, okay, you can put it to the test right away, maybe like in an open world game analogy, and then you can move on. Right. So that way you can go to the higher challenges, the things that you might want to do because that's more at your skill level. So yeah, just providing multiple branches of those things, I think, is really beneficial for students at every skill level. Thanks.
And as we move up here to the top track, and then we'll talk about failure traps and wrap up with a final question. As we move up all the way to the top, we're talking about, interestingly enough, like real world authentic PBL or presenting and displaying. However, I think you could challenge both what Nick and I put on here, which is if this is the interesting part, the real world authentic stuff, and this stuff down here is the less interesting stuff where you're learning like theory and content, how many kids are we losing down here in that mental and situational plane that are going down into this failure trap area because the content isn't as interesting? There's a lot of stuff folks put in the failure trap section. Um, Consider things like grades and grading. If I get like a D or an F or an assignment in that situational or kind of basic understanding phase, why would I continue to move up that plane and push towards the skill ceiling if I'm demotivated? Uh, Same as I think with behavior. Like if I feel like I can't go to the bathroom, if I'm late and the teacher's mad at me and I get frustrated, like I wouldn't want to continue playing a video game if the video game made me feel bad playing it. I want to feel good not doing well because that's kind of the whole point. That's what makes it entertaining. So if I were to turn on the game and it would make me feel bad about myself, why would I keep doing that? As well as the lack of opportunity to keep doing things. Like if there's nothing else for me to do, I'm not going to turn the game back on. And the exact same way, like why would I be in the classroom if there's nothing for me to do there? Other things to consider as well would be like there's too much stuff in general. So on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's either too little things to do, or maybe there's too much to do. If I'm overloaded with homework or workload, I'm going to be too stressed out to want to be in that space, which in and of itself is an issue, whether that be stress and anxiety and depression for a student, but also, as Chris adds, for the teacher on both ends of the spectrum. Um, as well as, and we had covered this as well when we were talking about the skill floor, if a course is designed in a way where a disability might limit a student's learning and it's not designed for that, well, I'm going to be stuck at this failure trap range perpetually. And that's going to be a major problem. There's a lack of a proper support. And then kind of like what we're getting at here with the training too, tying this all together as we're getting close to time. If our classrooms look like, as we started off here with this why question, if our classrooms look like the bottom end of the spectrum being, here's all this information, now move up the ladder by going through this basic information, well, the vast majority of people aren't going to want to participate in it because they're going to forget stuff along the way. They're going to be stuck at that low difficulty level. And I think both Nick and I would make the argument that the vast majority of classrooms look like how a lot of these games are designed here at this very first slide that we presented. It's here are all the key terms listed at the top of the paper. Now go and do something with it. And that's it's easy to design something that way, but it isn't necessarily the most effective. The question then becomes, how do I design a classroom that looks more like that Super Meat Boy example, where it's instantaneously being applied because I'm discovering the content on my own? And that's a difficult thing to do, but that's what video game designers do. And it's also what good learning design looks like as well. So I know we're at time, but I'm gonna put 2 minutes on here. A quick 2 minutes, and then we'll finalize it, which is this training section here at the bottom. Um, section F. Consider here just for 2 minutes, what would it look like to have proper supports to help learners learn as we move up this ladder? So if someone's here at the bottom, what supports can we offer them to encourage them to move up? If someone's at the top, how do we keep them progressing perhaps beyond the skill level or even into something else? So we're just going to take a couple minutes here, putting it all together, tying it all together. What would good training look like?
Hey, Chris,
And we'll
real quick
go
before you
from
do
there.
that, I
Yep.
want to come back if you all see where I'm at on section 8 here with difficulty. This is a good part to think about who has agency over the game's difficulty, because I think oftentimes classrooms are more explicit, right? They're not adaptive because generally you don't get more supports if you're doing poorly. It's more bootstrapped. And the classes don't generally get more difficult the better you are at them. You kind of hit that skill ceiling early and then you just plateau. We're kind of stuck at that explicit difficulty level because the course is time locked, to a semester long thing. And we were going to do on Tuesday, November 8th, what we were going to do because it was on the pacing guide, not being responsive. It's really thinking about that implicit difficulty level where the difficulty is defined by the player. So you might even have high skill players who need time or days where just other things are going on where they're going to pick a lower level to engage with, maybe something that's not going to be pushing them at the extremities of competition and skill level and frustration, and pick the hardest boss fight or the most difficult Minecraft build, because that's just not the headspace that they're in there either. So I think my take is always going to be to provide multiple means, kind of in that universal design for learning context of recruiting interest and motivation, and providing high range, a wide range of challenges that students can enter into regardless of their ability, but really recruiting by choice, interest, and motivation as well. So that's something to kind of consider as we move into this next section. Chris, if you want to put
Awesome.
that timer on.
Yeah. So let's just spend a couple minutes here on the F section here for training, and then that'll be it. And we'll just summarize everything and talk about next steps. So here we go.
All right.
Nice.
We got it.
So
This is great.
I'm gonna quickly summarize this.
We got a lot of
and
thoughts here.
and I think that will lead us into a lot of interesting next steps. So in terms of where folks enter, there are a lot of ideas on like what the solution looks like in order to help folks progress up in a meaningful way. Nick writes about how are we going to design structures and mechanics that we can use the entire course. So building blocks that we can build off of beyond just like rote memorization terms. What supports are there? For example, like I think about things like retaking tests, or like things that we can look at content wise, like how do our grading discipline, curriculum concepts allow us to continually move up this ladder and not feel like we're going to fail? How do we basically design our own Hades game within the classroom? Um, and also this kind of all relates here, these three, which is how do we start with authentic PBL? How do we apply that knowledge when we first start? Like how do we do discovery learning, as Chris writes here, where the teacher is going to design experience where kids are finding out things for their own. I think a really good example of this that most folks probably went through are like well-designed science labs, where you don't know what is going to happen, but you're at least given the tools to experiment and try different things out. And then you're like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. And then you learn what that is, and then you want to learn more. You're discovering it alongside the teacher. The solution isn't presented to you, but the teacher kind of knows where you're going to go. That's tricky, right? It's tricky to design something where you're leading folks down a certain path and you're discovering it together. And I think that is, and I'll get to that question too about like, what do you do with class size here in a second. Um, but it depends on the scale and sequence. It also deals with designing the environment itself, which Ryan's alluding to here in terms of like flow states and mercy and try again, etc., which is is the space conducive to learning to begin with, right? Is there a space that all learners can participate in, whether it be a more like loud collaborative space, or is it like other quiet spaces where students can learn on their own? There's spaces that they can go to for mentoring, and kind of learn in the way that makes the most sense to them. And is the content designed in a way where people are loved and respected and cared for, which is going to be baseline to any of these other things occurring. Um, Something else to consider too is the value of lived experience, field trips, and community in all of this. Starting off with field trips is solid because that's going to hook kids in to understanding how these concepts are applied. There's probably no better example of self-discovery learning than just going somewhere and learning about something, because you're seeing it for yourself. You're learning by being there, which is about as experiential as you could possibly get. Um, in terms of being overloaded by class size, I think there's two different answers. One is like the more pedagogical approach is how can you design your class to be open-ended so that students are building a lot of those structures and providing feedback. But there's also the dual revolution model of recognizing that it's not all, sunshine and roses. There's also space here for teacher advocacy and recognizing that like some of this stuff is really difficult to do for teachers for obvious reasons. We have to push whatever we can in terms of our own power and privilege, to do what we can in our space as well, simultaneously saying like, hey, like there's some serious classroom structures that are a problem here that's going to make some of this stuff really difficult to do, and we have to focus on the teacher structure side as well.
And I
For
think,
time
Chris,
purposes, yeah.
there's a yes and here, because in my experience, opening it up to more student choice and autonomy actually meant that I had more time to support kids who were stuck on the lower skill or, stuck with whatever barriers. It need not be content or academic related, because then I could provide the choices first. I could provide choice and the students who could make those choices because they're at that level of social, emotional, cultural, right? They have all of those toolkits. They can make that choice and then they can guide their own experience upward. And that meant that I didn't have to guide, 32 students all in one section, all at the same time. I could say, hey, here are these 3 levels that you can choose from here today. You make choices, and the students who are able to, right, they go do that. I can support then one-on-one or in small groups, then the other kids in that as well. So I've kind of felt that it actually was a support for those larger class sizes, a support for, a differentiation for a wide range of skills, because it's not saying I'm going to target interventions at every single level for 32 kids, because that's, then that's when the work gets overwhelming and impossible and difficult. It says, I'm going to provide, a more open-ended option, a more structured option, and then a very, rigid structured option that I'm going to be working alongside with there. And with the goal being, it not just helps students like learn the content, the objectives of the course, but actually like helps move them more into that middle level where they can make, decisions and they can be more autonomous in the course, because that's the goal really, right? Is to have students, operating in your world of the classroom, having the skills, the capacity, the ability, et cetera, to make those decisions as learners about what they're going to do and how, and then just show you. But again, of course, we have to scaffold students in being successful
Right.
in doing it.
Exactly. And as we move up the ladder here, I just kind of tossed one in the middle, which is something that we already mentioned when we were going through it, which is those multiple pathways. So as then you're moving up, and we have all of these support structures in place in terms of discovery, learning, and thinking about things in different ways and experiential learning. You then, as kids move into that situational point, have multiple pathways. So you're displaying learning in the way that makes the most sense for you on any given day, very much that universal design for learning. You're creating a space that's loving and caring. It's a community where I want to keep coming back to, where I'm presenting concepts in the way that makes the most sense for what I'm doing. It's very much that workshop model, as opposed to everyone moving at the exact same pace, following the teacher on the teacher pacing guide. And that means that, people are going to be falling anywhere on this chart, like they're going to be all flying around. The the point is though, is that they are anyway. Even if we think that we're progressing up this ladder together with the entire course, kids are all over this map. It makes a lot more sense to design your classroom so that kids are all over the map. And sorry, Nick, I'm going to keep going past your UDL thing because we're already way over it. So as we reach the end here, all right, we then consider like opportunities for self-direction. Could a student start their own personal project? Maybe they move into a different course. Maybe like we have structures in place beyond our own classroom where kids can just keep going. Um, of course, whatever we put up here has to be what kids would already want to do anyway, because it's like beyond the scope potentially of the course. So like what ways can we make applicable, meaningful situations for kids to take that content and apply it to something else beyond the scope of the course that is meaningful. So there's a lot of great content here, and really what we want to leave you with is consider what would this activity look like if you took a very similar structure to this? What would it look like if you did it with a group of other teachers? Or even if you did this activity with kids, maybe towards the beginning of the school year where you're talking about like, this is why the course is designed in this way. Think about the games that you play. This is what we're thinking about. Because it helps us understand something from a new perspective. Um, so I
So
recognize
to
that we're
move,
over time here. To summarize here in terms of our next steps, if you want to join us next time, we'll have a real game developer on February 11th, and you can see the rest of these on our website. But February 11th is talking about design choices and player behavior with Seth Koster. So thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around. We'll be here for a bit, but that will wrap up our first thing.
thanks all.